due to graphic subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised.
The crime scenes that were responded to, the killer demonstrated a lot of violence.
He was doing horrible things to people, sodomizing, gouging people's eyes out.
The so-called Night Stalker may have struck again.
No matter where we were, there was a report about Night Stalker. It was on the TV. It was in all the papers.
Most serial killers follow some pattern. There was nothing predictable about what this guy did.
This was normal folks like you and I who were being slaughtered.
I'm afraid for everybody, elderly, young.
There was a faceless, nameless, violent criminal out there, and you didn't know where he was going to hit next.
City in Fear. Here's John Siegenthaler.
Over the years, Los Angeles has been the scene of its fair share of high-profile crimes. The Manson murders, the Hillside Strangler killings, the murder of O.J. Simpson's ex-wife, to name a few. But in 1985, a series of random, barbaric attacks by a devil-worshipping serial killer created an unprecedented sense of terror in L.A. This stranger ultimately became known as the Night Stalker. Los Angeles, California, City of Angels, known for its palm trees, beaches, and near-perfect weather. But in the mid-1980s, the city became terrorized by a madman who drove the freeways at night, randomly picking an exit and hunting down his victims. June 28, 1984, in the quiet community of Glassell Park, 10 minutes from downtown L.A., an elderly woman is asleep in her apartment. A cool breeze blows through an open window. Just before 5 a.m., an intruder removes the screen and climbs inside the woman's bedroom. Within seconds, he plunges a knife into her chest, stabbing her repeatedly and slashing her throat. Police later lift fingerprints from the window screen, but without a suspect, the clue leads them nowhere. Almost a year goes by before the intruder strikes again. This time, on March 17, 1985, he shoots and kills 2 women in the San Gabriel Valley communities of Monterey Park and Rosemead. In the Rosemead attack, the woman's roommate escapes and later describes her assailant to police as a white male, 25 to 30 years old, 6 feet tall with a medium build and curly brown hair.
Most crime in Los Angeles happens in the urban core. These crimes were happening in these supposedly safe suburban communities.
10 days later, the killer goes hunting again. This time, he drives to the neighboring town of Whittier, where he beats a 64-year-old man to death and fatally stabs his wife, carving her eyes out while she is still alive.
Here's a guy who is driving down the freeways at night. He picks an off-ramp, goes into a neighborhood, picks a house, walks in. He knows at that point in time he's going to kill people.
But even with the close proximity of the murders, police are not immediately convinced they're the work of one killer. Frank Salerno was an L.A. Sheriff's homicide detective at the time.
The traditional way of looking at serial killers is obviously looking at an MO, a modus operandi. The killer gets into a habit or a pattern that he's comfortable with. In this case, we weren't seeing that. We had victims whose throats were cut. We had victims who were beaten with tire irons. We had victims who were choked. We had victims who were shot. He was all over the place.
After searching the ransacked crime scenes, however, investigators begin to detect a pattern.
One of the common threads was the fact that a .22 was used in a number of the cases, and then we had this shoe print.
The print, found outside a window at one of the crime scenes, is from a size 11 Avia training shoe. Gil Carrillo was another detective working the investigation.
There wasn't enough physical evidence to know for sure if there was in fact a serial killer. So the cases were continued to investigate independently of each other as opposed to as a task force.
For nearly 2 months, the killer seems to vanish. But on May 14th, he returns to Monterey Park with a vengeance, this time at the home of 66-year-old William Doy and his invalid wife, Lily. Slipping through a bathroom window, the intruder searches the house, shooting Mr. Doy in the head before sexually assaulting Mrs. Doy. The couple initially survives the attack, but Mr. Doy dies at the hospital later that morning. Investigator Linda Arthur is one of the first to arrive at the house.
When I got there, I saw that the house had been ransacked. Mr. Doy was in his bed and he was shot, and I believe they were tending to Mrs. Doy.
Examining the scene, Arthur tries to determine if this attack bears any similarities to the previous San Gabriel area crimes.
I was looking for shoe prints, a specific type of shoe print in a Via tennis shoe. I also was looking for casings, and I found casings in the living room. And then the ransacking was common, and I found that in the bedrooms and in the living room. That murder was committed by the same person.
2 weeks later, on May 29th, there's another attack. 2 elderly women, Mabel Bell, a grandmother of 12, and her sister, Florence Lang, are asleep in their home in the quiet suburb of Monrovia, 7 miles north of Rosemead. They never hear the killer walk through their unlocked front door and slip down the hallway to their bedrooms. He uses electrical cords to bind their hands and brutally attacks them with a hammer to their heads, leaving them barely alive. Both sisters later die in the hospital. For the first time, the killer leaves a disturbing calling card, a drawing often recognized as satanic.
One of the things that stands out in my mind about how horrible he was and how evil he was carving the pentagram in a body or, drawing it on the wall.
The next night, the killer finds another victim, this time in Burbank. He enters the home of 42-year-old Carol Kyle and rapes and beats her while her 11-year-old son is tied up in a closet. They both survive, and Carol provides police with a description of her assailant that closely matches a previous sketch. Since the police are reluctant to reveal specific details about the crime, the media begin to suspect that these are more than random acts of violence.
I'd already been in radio news about 7 years, and I'd seen my share, if you would, of grisly crimes, of serial murders, things like that. It started off as a one-off. Okay, you have another homicide. As the second, third, fourth ones began to happen, that's when people began to say something different is happening here. But until actually the police say it, you can hypothesize, but you don't really put that on the air that in your judgment it's a serial killer case. Not until the sheriff's detective said, we have a pattern here, one man is doing that.
While the public is still unaware that a serial killer is stalking the streets of Los Angeles, on June 14th, a family in the community of Pico Rivera comes perilously close to tragedy.
I had not felt well, so I fell asleep on the sofa in the living room, and I was awakened by a very loud noise. I definitely sensed that there was somebody trying to get inside my home. I felt fear from head to foot. But I knew because my girls were all asleep, I had to get to that back bedroom and get John as fast as I could.
Lorraine wakes her husband John, a deputy for the county sheriff's office.
We had one window in the dining room that we hadn't opened up in 2 previous years we've lived there. And when I went and looked at the window, moved the drapes, the window was wide open. I looked down on the flower bed, I could see a footprint.
Although the intruder was scared away, John calls the police, fearing he may still be in the neighborhood.
Before we knew it, this place was covered with law enforcement. I didn't know what was happening. I thought, boy, they're sure doing a lot for a prowler.
What the Leyvas don't realize is that after finding the matching Avia shoe print, police suspect that this prowler is in fact a vicious killer.
The police had a bad decision to make. It was, do we divulge that there is a serial killer out there who's randomly killing people, or don't we?
In cases like this, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But we knew that the individual wasn't stopping. He wasn't going to stop till he was caught or killed.
But investigators know that admitting to the public that a serial killer is at large could create panic in the City of Angels. Coming up.
Comforter had a bloody Avia footprint on it. And just speaking about it right now, I have chills on my arms.
Another quiet suburb is shaken as more victims die at the hands of the killer. It is June 1985, and a serial killer is stalking the streets of Los Angeles, savagely murdering people in their homes in the middle of the night. So far, the killer has claimed the lives of at least 8 people, and police fear it's only a matter of time before he strikes again.
He was terrorizing Los Angeles County. His methods, the fact that he was randomly picking locations, could have been any location at any time. That's what made it so scary.
On June 28th, the killer moves north to the town of Arcadia, where he stabs to death a 28-year-old school teacher, nearly cutting off her head. 4 days later, on July 2nd, police are called to the Arcadia home of Mary Louise Cannon, a 75-year-old grandmother. Her body has been severely beaten and her throat is slit.
The city of Arcadia, the crime rate is relatively low, and especially for violent crime. We can go an entire year without any murders at all or homicides. And in this case, we had these brutal and violent homicides, which was quite unusual.
Hoping to prevent public hysteria, authorities remain tight-lipped with the media.
You knew there were murders being committed. You knew they were fairly horrific because detectives weren't saying some things about them other than to say there was significant trauma to the victims.
Police have already collected a mountain of evidence pointing to one killer, and a clue found at the next crime scene would convince them that they had no choice but to alert the public.
Morning of July 5th, we were awakened and told that we had a victim out in Sierra Madre where a 16-year-old girl was left for dead. She was beaten with a tire iron and choked.
A criminalist from the Sheriff's Crime Lab came out, and she stepped into the living room and said, "Fellas, found something interesting," and there she held out a comforter, and the comforter had a bloody Avia footprint on it. And just speaking about it right now, I have chills on my arms because I'll never forget that day. And it was that day that everything charged up, because now it's definitive. Now let's run at it. Once the media got it, then the frenzy began.
Pre-dawn break-in. A male victim shot. It's all too familiar to investigators who say the so-called walk-in killer has struck again.
They would call us up, and they would typically ask, "Well, what are you calling him? Do you have a name for him?" "Yes, we do." "And what is the name?" "We call him suspect."
Trying to put a label or a name on this guy. This is LA, this is Hollywood. There's a clash of egos, I think, among newspaper outlets, TV and radio. But we'd have some executives who say, "Listen, we got to go with Valley Intruder." Channel 4 News, we called him the walk-in killer. And it was a clash of egos. Our news director told us we're not going to call him the Valley Intruder. Well, why walk-in killer? That's such a benign name, the walk-in killer. I mean, what's he doing knocking on the doors? "Excuse me, can I come in?"
God bless the Herald Examiner. They came up with the Night Stalker, and that's all he was called after that.
No matter where we were, there was a report about Night Stalker. It was on the TV. It was in all the papers.
Investigators say the attacker is attacking single women, elderly couples, children, anyone, any place where windows are left unlocked, the home's poorly lit.
That is what really intimidated people. There was a faceless, nameless, violent criminal out there, and you didn't know where he was going to hit next. And when people began to learn the magnitude of what the person was doing in here, not just a burglary, not just an assault, but far more, you could see there was a palpable shaking of these people's core.
These are faces of fear, faces of concern. People who now know that a 30-year-old Monterey Park woman may have been the first victim of the walk-in killer.
It had to do with people being invaded in their homes, and I think that was what really grabbed people's attention.
Part of the news coverage said that this person doing these acts was coming in through open windows that were left open due to the heat. So a lot of people were saying they didn't care if they couldn't open their windows. They didn't care if they didn't have air conditioning. They wanted to be safe.
The lieutenant says the daily calls have doubled from frightened residents who aren't sure what to do. The police tell them to make sure they secure their windows and doors with proper locks.
In a city where so many people are strangers, people who barely know their neighbors suddenly start to look out for them.
JC's, they came in and we sold them some locks at a cost. They were going out to elderly people and they were installing free of charge deadbolts on the doors.
It was an anxious time and you had a lot of fears. Everybody had their porch lights on and security lighting. Seems like it was Christmas time practically.
This was everybody. That's what was different about this. It wasn't just women, wasn't just men, wasn't just children, it wasn't just derelicts, it wasn't just prostitutes. It was everybody. And you didn't know who was going to be next, and that was the scary part.
Up next, for one investigator, the Night Stalker strikes too close to home.
I could hear in the distance a woman's voice calling my name, and she said that he drove away, and I just instinctively knew it was him.
It is July 1985. For the past year, a serial killer, now dubbed the Night Stalker, has been prowling suburban Los Angeles neighborhoods in the dark, slipping through unlocked windows and doors, and murdering 10 victims. In a city of more than 8 million residents, suddenly no one feels safe.
The attitude in the community was slowly simmering panic.
As soon as it would get dark, you would be locking up and making sure everything was closed. The fear was just inescapable.
It was just terrifying. My girlfriend Amelia actually slept with a knife in between her mattresses.
There is some pattern to the attacks. Often victims' homes are yellow and near freeways. The killer enters through an unlocked door or window.
There was a rumor going around that if you lived in a white or a yellow house that was near the freeway, you would be a target. Well, we happened to live in a yellow house that was 2 blocks from the freeway.
That was one of the rumors, that he liked yellow houses. But he didn't only hit yellow houses. He hit any house. It really didn't matter what color it was.
1 Adam 22, South Park and Papa Fiber property.
On the night of July 7th, the killer returns to Monterey Park and ironically chooses the house next door to investigator Linda Arthur. It is 3:30 in the morning when Arthur hears her neighbor, 63-year-old Sophie Dickman, calling for help from her bedroom window.
I came out my back door. I could hear in the distance a woman's voice calling my name. Came over to the wall and reached over and asked her, what's wrong, what happened? And she said, I've been robbed and raped and I'm handcuffed to my bed. It was something in the air. It was her voice, and she said that he drove away. And I just instinctively knew it was him. What we found out later on in the morning is that after he left Sophie's house, then he drove down the hill. He went about a quarter of a mile and broke into another lady's house, and he killed her.
61-year-old Joyce Nelson becomes the Night Stalker's 11th murder victim.
We went out there, and not only did we see a footprint on the front porch of her house, there was one left on the side of her head where he had stomped her to death.
This guy was literally stylizing his work, his art of crime, and it was changing and expanding every single time he was hitting.
It appeared that he would go into a residence, and if there was a male there, he would eliminate the male because that was the obstacle to get to his lust, which was the female.
He would degrade the woman in any number of ways, which, if most people knew the acts that he was performing, you'd realize this guy was off the charts. And I don't know how you measure how evil somebody is, but this man was at the top of the food chain.
The scariest for me was that he was still out there and that he was in my neighborhood. So I was really very frightened.
While the public is now aware that a serial killer is on the loose, police are careful not to reveal too much information to the killer himself.
Obviously, there are certain things that we did not want released. The shoe print was very near and dear to us, type of weapons that were used. I was aware the killer was reading the newspapers because of something that had occurred at one of the scenes and then didn't occur from that point forward. In one of the Monterey Park cases, there was a great deal of publicity in the newspaper about a 9/11 call that was placed from the house by the surviving victim. And from that point forward, every case that followed that, the phone was either taken or the lines were cut. My mind was only because the killer had read the newspapers, had read about the 9/11 call, and decided that wasn't going to happen again.
It was a legitimate fear because it could be you. There's no pattern. The guy can show up in your grocery store tomorrow or your bedroom tonight.
Up up next.
To say that it was disturbing is an understatement.
Sensitive evidence is exposed to the public, and the police are furious.
Once again, John Siegenthaler.
As the summer of 1985 wears on in Los Angeles, not only is the city suffering through a brutal heat wave, it's held hostage by a merciless serial killer. Dubbed the Night Stalker, he invades homes at random under the cover of darkness, savagely attacking and torturing his victims. With the murders occurring in quick succession throughout the city, fear is rapidly escalating to panic.
14 25 on tech 2.
I remember coming to work and a lot of people would come worn out and they'd say, I didn't get any sleep last night because of the Night Stalker. I was afraid of him.
That summer, it was everywhere. It seemed like no matter what city it was, he was in it. Even like tiny little Sierra Madre. That was amazing. It was so freaky because half people don't even know where Sierra Madre is, let alone that there's a serial killer in it.
I would do things at night where I would have the phone right next to the bed and ready to dial 911 just in case I heard something.
911 emergency.
Fearing that no one in LA is safe from the killer, citizens take drastic measures to defend themselves.
Barbara Chase never thought of using a gun until now. Fear is her motivation. Fear of the person who the authorities believe killed 2 people in her Monrovia neighborhood.
Okay. We had ladies come in here. We had older people come in here. Some people said they would never own a gun before and changed their minds because of this. So we had a lot of first-time gun buyers. Anything and everything sold during those days, but California had a waiting period on these. 15 days, I believe, at that time. And a lot of people didn't want to wait for the waiting period. They wanted a gun right now. The only choice then was either a rifle or shotgun. So a great many people opted for this because they just wanted to have something to take home that night. We could not keep these shotguns in stock. We were looking all over the country for them at that time.
Shooting ranges are suddenly packed with anxious first-time gun users.
We've noticed an increase of about 150% in our classes, and 35% of those are ladies.
I have grandchildren. They come to stay. Should I sit by and watch them get killed, or should I try to save them?
Now grab it with your right hand.
You never know who's coming in the front door these days, in the window, and I just want to make sure that I'm up to snuff.
The public panics as everyone expects the killer to strike again. But no one is prepared for the massacre on the night of July 20th. Sometime after midnight, the Night Stalker first enters the Glendale home of Max and Layla Knighting. Once childhood sweethearts, the elderly couple is savagely murdered in their bed.
He shot Max in the top of the head, and Leila's hands were shredded where she'd fought him off with a knife. Then he used her blood and wrote something on the wall in their house.
All of a sudden, 2 of our church members had been murdered. I mean, it was like it was almost unreal, like it just came out of nowhere.
Nobody ever dreamed it was going to happen right down here, less than a mile from the church. You think at the time that you can't live through this sorrow, but I could gladly have had, if I'd had a gun and had a chance, I would very happily have shot him myself.
But the Knightings aren't the only ones to be killed that night. After leaving their house, the Night Stalker heads north on the freeway to Sun Valley. At 4:15 a.m., he shoots and kills 32-year-old Chainarong Kovaneth with a single bullet to the head. The killer then sexually assaults the man's wife and ties up their 8-year-old son before ransacking their house. Mrs. Kovaneth later gives police a physical description much different than those provided by earlier victims.
A male, Caucasian, possibly Latin, about 6 feet tall, 160 pounds, curly hair, very discolored teeth, widely gapped.
The composite drawing of the suspect sort of matched maybe 75% of all men in the county of Los Angeles. During lunchtime, I'd walk around the streets of Van Nuys and look at people, guys wearing baseball caps, and look and try to see under to see if it was him.
I remember cutting out pictures of the composites and putting them on the mirrors in the bathroom so that the kids would it would remain fresh in their minds to keep all the doors locked.
I think the search for this man really upped the involvement of neighborhood watches. Neighbors were watching out for one another. And I think the whole city, even the county, it was probably one of the biggest neighborhood watches around. Nobody took any chances.
We have a neighbor that was just single, and we watched out for her and made sure that if we saw any odd cars that weren't supposed to be there, that we would call the police.
My friend had a pickup truck, and we'd all get in the back when you used to be able to ride in the back of a truck, and we'd go in back alleys, and we were stalking the Night Stalker, in our minds.
By now, the Night Stalker has already killed at least 14 people. But the heightened sense of security in neighborhoods throughout LA does nothing to prevent him from striking again. On August 6th, around 2 a.m., he expands his reign of terror to the San Fernando Valley, slipping through an unlocked sliding glass door and shooting 38-year-old Chris Peterson and his wife Virginia as they sleep. Both survive the shooting, and Mr. Peterson fights back, tackling the killer, who quickly breaks free and runs from the house.
Blinds are drawn. No one is home. Then Virginia Peterson and their daughter want no one to find them, at least not until police find the man who tried to kill them. This woman did not want her face to appear on camera.
Well, I'm very, very scared. I have all the windows locked.
I'm afraid for everybody, elderly, young.
As police and the public wrestle with the terrifying notion that no city is safe, the killer strikes again in a new place. 2 days after the San Fernando Valley attack, he travels east to Diamond Bar.
The victim was Elias Abawath, a 35-year-old computer engineer. He was shot and killed. His wife was beaten, and the house ransacked.
I'm scared. I think everybody else is scared along with us. It's a scary situation.
That scene, we had a great deal of evidence. We had the fact that phones were disabled. We had a new shoe print. We had a gun that had been used before. We had some conversation with a surviving victim. He actually tells the surviving victim, don't pray to God, pray to Satan.
All of the Night Stalker's attacks have taken place within a 50-mile radius until August 17th, 1985.
California's newest serial killer has reportedly struck in San Francisco.
66-year-old Peter Pan is gunned down in his home in San Francisco. His wife is also shot and beaten, but manages to survive. She identifies her attacker from police sketches. It's the Night Stalker.
Once we talked with San Francisco, the detectives there was no doubt in our mind that that case was connected to our cases. So we shared with them everything that we had as far as what we were looking for.
We understand that there is writing on the wall in there that says Jack the Ripper, and that is one of the links between here and LA.
I don't know where you're getting your information, and anything that comes from this case has to come from the San Francisco Police Department. Okay? Thank you.
We had a flyer with the via shoe print, the make, the model, vehicle description, guns used, but it was for law enforcement only. We were very specific, very emphatic about that.
But the San Francisco mayor calls a press conference that infuriates LA law enforcement, where she reveals critical information to the public.
The ballistics on the weapon that killed both Mr. and Mrs. Pan over the weekend are the same ballistics on, I understand, more than a dozen murders committed in Southern California.
And there she's holding the very same flyer that we said was for law enforcement only, and she's talking about the Avia shoes, she's talking about a vehicle description, she's talking about weapons.
I'm one that believes that people should be warned when there's a problem.
So the media then and the public became aware of everything that we knew about the killer and what we were looking for. To say that it was disturbing is an understatement.
Coming up,
that information has not only jeopardized the conduct of our investigation, but in reality, it places this community in jeopardy.
Detectives now fear that with all their evidence exposed, the Night Stalker may disappear. When their best evidence on the Night Stalker case is made public by the mayor of San Francisco, detectives in Los Angeles are devastated.
It was really upsetting that somebody in that high a position could allow that kind of information to be released.
They had no idea how traumatized we were, and living this 16 hours a day and then have it all thrown out the window. I was not a happy camper.
L.A. Sheriff Sherman Block responds immediately by holding a late-night press conference of his own.
Some of these agencies have released some very critical, sensitive information. That information has not only jeopardized the conduct of our investigation, but in reality it places this community in jeopardy because it impedes our ability to go forward fully with the investigation.
Challenged by major setbacks, detectives struggle to establish the killer's identity.
We do not have anything of substance as of yet, and absolutely nothing that indicates that the suspect is close to being apprehended.
It's frustrating because you're thinking, where is this going next? Who is the next victim going to be? Are we ever going to get a sense of who this guy is? Because we have case after case after case, murder after murder, burglary after burglary, yet no ID.
Detectives have no idea who the killer is or where he will strike again, but his terrifying presence is impossible to escape.
He was doing horrible things to people, sodomizing, gouging people's eyes out, leaving marks. It was hideous.
During that period of time when I was coming home, I had my duty weapon with me, usually right under my leg. Before I got out of my car to walk into my front door, I would look around to make sure everything looked safe, and I would come in with my gun in my hand, making sure that there was nobody inside and that the doors were still locked.
For the first time in my career, I was actually sleeping with a weapon on the nightstand. My wife, she was spending most of the time either at her parents' house or my parents' house.
This case, without a doubt, was probably the only case that ever affected what I did at home. Having two large dogs, I knew that was a deterrent or at least an alarm system as to if my house was picked at random, that I at least have a chance to react.
Detectives decide to enlist the public's help in their search for the Night Stalker, offering a $10,000 reward for information.
Investigators believe the so-called Night Stalker will be caught because of a tip from the public.
The media coverage increased. Phone calls to the Bureau increased.
Friends are calling and cops are calling. Well, hey, I think you really ought to look at this guy because, this sounds like something he would do. And getting clues from thousands of people.
Possible 459 now. Informant here's someone trying to get into the kitchen window.
Police naturally had to respond. And of course, police to some extent, and then also the news media, were chasing their tails because they're all over the place.
U14, I'm code 6.
We did institute placing of scanners in our police cars at the time so that we could listen to neighboring agencies. So it became a real resource sharing situation where everybody was out to help everybody else out to try and catch this person.
We felt we'd have the suspect, whoever he was. We were closing in on him. We felt he was making mistakes. He was getting too brazen.
On Saturday, August 24th, a day after the press conferences in San Francisco and Los Angeles, the Night Stalker is on the move again. This time, he steals an orange station wagon in downtown LA and drives 70 miles south to the quiet town of Mission Viejo. There, he enters the home of 29-year-old Bill Carnes, shooting him in the head before beating and sexually assaulting his fiancée. She later gives detectives a chilling message from the attacker.
That's where he said, tell him I was here, tell him the Night Stalker was here. He wanted us to know.
25 on tech 2.
What was the mood in this neighborhood last night?
Very frightened, and even though the police were here all night long, nobody in my house could sleep at all. I mean, it was still very uneasy and very frightening, and there were a lot of people walking around, a lot of people locking their doors, which normally we wouldn't do.
Unknown to the killer, a teenage boy sees the orange station wagon leave the scene and writes down the license plate number.
We had gotten a call at our office the next day from an individual who said his car was stolen, and it matches the description of the car that's mentioned in the Mission Viejo. That car was recovered a few days later in downtown Los Angeles in a parking lot, abandoned.
They staked out that car for 24 hours to see if he would return to it. He didn't. Then scientific investigations people got a hold of it, printed the whole car.
When it was processed, there was a fingerprint lifted, partial fingerprint from the interior of the car, and that was a big break in the case.
Over the next few days, the Department of Justice in Sacramento frantically searches their files for a match to the fingerprint.
In 1985, they were going through fingerprints by hand. They didn't have a computer to do this. This was old gumshoe work.
The painstaking research pays off. investigators finally matched the print to 25-year-old Richard Ramirez, a drifter and thief who had been arrested in Los Angeles the previous year for stealing a car. As news of a possible suspect quickly spreads among the media, officials call a press conference.
Through a series of investigative leads, we have identified the Night Stalker as Richard Ramirez, also known as Ricardo Ramirez. He is a Latin male, brown eyes, black hair, 6'1", 150 pounds, originally from El Paso, Texas, who has recently been active in the Los Angeles area.
People could literally put a face to their fears, and they knew what they should be afraid of now if they saw it coming near them. Plus, in a city this big, to have your picture out there, if you're not leaving town, you're going to be seen.
The bad thing was he was still out there, and you didn't know if he was going to hit again. And so you were still scared, but at least you knew who your enemy was.
I remember telling my girlfriend at the time, I said, either he's watching this press conference right now and he's going to flee the city, or he doesn't know what's going on. Somebody's going to spot him within 24 hours and they will arrest him.
Up next, the citizens of Los Angeles finally come face to face with their enemy.
It was just a horrible feeling for him to look at me.
How the Night Stalker is finally caught. The Night Stalker now has a face. It is that of Richard Ramirez. His mugshot photo from an earlier arrest is on the front page of every Los Angeles newspaper, and the police are hoping he has not left L.A.
We're assuming that he's still in the Los Angeles area. We have received some information that he might be coming this way, but that information has not been substantiated at this time.
What police don't know is that Ramirez has just returned to Los Angeles on a bus from Phoenix, where he has been visiting his brother. As he walks the streets of L.A., he has no idea that he has been identified as the Night Stalker.
And walks down to the local liquor store. When he gets into the liquor store, on every newspaper, the front page was his picture. And he realizes that he's in trouble. So he leaves the liquor store, he gets on a bus.
On the bus, about 4 miles east of downtown, a passenger happened to look at the newspaper and saw that was the gentleman. There was another passenger on the bus. He got off the bus. There happened to be a phone right there at the corner.
Sheriff Private Martinez, help you?
And there were telephone calls coming in constantly to sheriffs and Los Angeles Police Department that this fellow's on the bus.
He went down a couple of bus stops, exited, started running, and ran across the 5 freeway over 10-foot sound walls.
Keep in mind, Mr. Ramirez at that point had operated at night, one-on-one with his victims. Now all of a sudden it's broad daylight and he's trying to steal a car in East Los Angeles. The thing about East Los Angeles, it's a very insular neighborhood. It's very tight. The people on the blocks know each other. And if someone tries to victimize someone in that neighborhood, odds are it isn't just going to be one person who you're going to be dealing with, it's going to be the whole neighborhood.
Ramirez flees to Hubbard Street, where he grabs Angelina De La Torres as she gets into her car. She screams for help, alerting her husband and neighbors who run to her rescue.
And he tried to get
There was a gentleman, there was another passenger on the bus. He got off the bus. There happened to be a phone right there at the corner.
Sheriff Private Martinez, help you?
And there were telephone calls coming in constantly to sheriffs and Los Angeles Police Department that this fellow's on the bus.
He went down a couple of bus stops, exited, started running, and ran across the 5 freeway over 10-foot sound walls.
Keep in mind, Mr. Ramirez at that point had operated at night, one-on-one with his victims. Now all of a sudden it's broad daylight and he's trying to steal a car in East Los Angeles. The thing about East Los Angeles, it's a very insular neighborhood. It's very tight. The people on the blocks know each other. And if someone tries to victimize someone in that neighborhood, odds are it isn't just going to be one person who you're going to be dealing with, it's going to be the whole neighborhood.
Ramirez flees to Hubbard Street, where he grabs Angelina De La Torres as she gets into her car. She screams for help, alerting her husband and neighbors who run to her rescue.
And he tried to get this one lady that was just starting her car. He tried to get her out and take her car. Then all the neighbors just hung together and got him, chased him down the street.
Through the heroics of a small neighborhood, the Night Stalker is finally apprehended.
My friend Dino happened to be on call. He is good in news instincts. He was just following the helicopters, he's driving, he's looking up, following them, and then heads into the East LA area, and these kids come slamming up to his door, pounding on it, says, "We got him, we got him, we got him." And they led him right to it, and boom.
And I composed a shot of him, and he looked right at me. That's the only time in my life that the hair in the back of my neck stood up, because I felt like I was looking into the eyes of evil. And everybody around me, they were saying, it's the killer, it's the killer. They just kept looking at him and looking at him.
Officers transport a bloodied Ramirez to a nearby police station.
Got to Hollenbeck Station, and this was sort of a surreal scene. Couldn't get anywhere near it to park. Hollenbeck Police Station was surrounded with citizens, literally. I mean, 10, 15 deep, because of his capture and the fact that he was there.
I'm just out here waiting to see him, that's all. We're just a relief, that's what it is. It's a relief for all the people here in Los Angeles.
I think you just get it over with and torture him, kill him right away, and have no mercy on him. If this is the true killer, which I hope it is, and that way people can live in peace again.
Finally, Detectives Carrillo and Salerno meet the killer they've been tracking for so long.
As soon as I walked in with Frank Salerno, he looked up and he knew who we were.
He says, I know who you are. He says, you're Frank Salerno. Never had a murder suspect ever do that before. And that was a result of the fact that the LA Times had written a story and had a photograph of myself on the front page. It was a very eerie feeling.
After interrogating Ramirez, Linda Arthur is brought in to fingerprint him.
He looked at me, and it was just a horrible feeling for him to look at me. He was very scary, and I could understand then what the victims were really feeling when he was there attacking them.
Fingerprint comparisons have been made here at Hollenbeck, and we're happy to announce that the individual we have in custody is Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
We couldn't leave Hollenbeck Station because they had to call for reinforcements because the crowd had grown so big on the outside, and they were afraid. They'd gotten word somebody had a gun out there and they were going to try and take him out. And I'm in the front seat, and I was saying, if somebody's going to start sniping, God, please don't let me get killed today after doing all this work.
A motorcade and helicopter escort take Ramirez to county jail as images of his arrest are broadcast throughout the city.
Among the hundreds gathered outside the police station, there's an almost carnival-like atmosphere of celebration. Not only excitement, but also relief.
I was in a hair salon at the time, and everybody in the salon got up and cheered. Everybody was relieved that had happened. I mean, it was a momentous morning.
When we found out this guy had been caught, we had the TV on. We wanted to have a party. We were so happy he was caught.
Earlier today, the residents here on Hubbard Street were filled with fear. Not anymore. Now the streets are filled with excitement.
A house party, man. What do you expect? We got that turkey.
We had a big block party, to be honest with you.
Just the relief to know that this person was caught and actually, physically harmed. I don't know. As creepy as it may sound, I was happy for that.
The citizens were greatly relieved this killer was off the street. Unfortunately, for the investigators involved in it, your work is really just beginning.
Although detectives are certain that Ramirez is the Night Stalker, in order to build a solid case against him, they continue their search for evidence.
Cadets from the Los Angeles Sheriff's Academy looking for the Night Stalker's pistol, a vital piece of evidence that could link Richard Ramirez to more than one of the killings.
Combing the East LA neighborhood where Ramirez was apprehended, investigators find several key pieces of evidence, including a gun, which they believe he discarded after running across the freeway.
The DA made up their mind. This guy is not going to get away. We aren't going to plea bargain. We aren't going to compromise. We're going to get him.
On the matter of people versus Richard Ramirez.
During a pretrial hearing, Ramirez makes a brief but chilling statement as officers lead him from the courtroom.
Who's safe?
Richard Ramirez is without a doubt the scariest, most evil defendant that I have ever seen in court, ever, bar none. But when somebody draws a pentagram on their bottom of their hand and says, "Hail Satan," that's not really normal. He was trying to scare all of us, and he did.
The worst part of the entire experience was covering the trial, because the testimony was so graphic and so horrific that I mean, I've covered a lot of trials and I've been around a long time, but I had to walk out during part of it.
For doing what he did and using the notion of being a satanic believer also went to him having no conscience about what he did. He was caught, yes, but you weren't going to take away what he had created, and that was a persona that people shuddered at. And I think he wanted to continue with that persona all the way to the end.
The trial of Richard Ramirez lasted more than a year, plenty of time for him to remain in the spotlight, somehow attracting the attention of many admiring women. In 1996, he married one of them, a freelance magazine editor.